2002 was a pretty good year for gaming. It was a time when game developers were still willing to take big risks with their franchises instead of the safer, more sterile gaming environment we get from AAA developers today. Super Mario Sunshine, The Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, Final Fantasy XI Online, Metroid Prime, Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos. We were a little over a year into the newest console generation, and this was the first one that could combine a compelling narrative with 3D visuals at a level of fidelity that didn't make people puke 15 years into the future. But one game would prove to ignite the imaginations of millions of people around the world, and would change the course of fanfiction forever. Why did I do this to myself? Kingdom Hearts is a unique beast even among the sometimes bizarre library of Square Enix titles. What makes it stand out, though, is that it's an unapologetically Square Enix-style RPG experience, but it's also Disney. Yep, it's the Disney-based RPG that you never knew you wanted. This is a game that mixes the characters of the Disney universe with the characters of Square Enix titles, more specifically, those of the Final Fantasy series on PlayStation and PlayStation 2 at the time. Forget Infinity War, this is the most ambitious crossover event in history. Where else can you fight Edgelord Cloud in the Colosseum from Hercules? Where else can you team up with Donald Duck, who is, by the way, a wizard for some reason, and use the power of a magical key to defend the land of Agrabah from the evil heartless shadow monsters? Yeah, that's what I thought. Nowhere. If it sounds ridiculous to you, then you're right. Nothing about anything that goes on in this game is normal or completely cohesive, and that's part of what makes it so great. You play the role of a naive child named Sora, who likes to hang out with his friends on an island. Being stupid children, the three of them decide that it'll be a great idea to build a dingy little raft and use that to run away from home, and if we're being realistic here, probably horribly die at sea. Honestly, their options are either starvation, being cooked alive by the sun, or dehydration. Come on, these kids don't know the first thing about logistics or how to plan a long voyage. Lucky for them though, Sora, Riku, and Kairi are literally saved from a salty death by a powerful darkness that's come to claim their world. It's at this moment that Sora is given the power of the Keyblade to defend himself from the darkness and is dumped right into Traverse Town alone, a place for refugees to gather after their world was similarly destroyed. Traverse Town is the place where the streams really start to cross, because not only is it home to a bunch of Final Fantasy and Disney characters alike, but it's where you finally meet your teammates for the game. Donald Duck and Goofy were tasked by none other than King Mickey himself to track down the wielder of the Keyblade, and shortly after getting your butt beaten by Leon from Final Fantasy VIII, the unlikely trio meets up for the first time to take down a horde of Heartless together, followed by the game's first real boss. After that, they hop into a spaceship made out of gummy candy, I guess, and take to the skies to fly to other Disney-themed worlds, meeting other Disney characters, and taking part in tiny bits of your favorite movies as you fight the Heartless. All of this happens almost completely incidentally as Sora is searching for his friends, and Donald and Goofy are trying to get Sora back to the king. I'm just gonna come out and say it, I don't think that the story or storytelling of Kingdom Hearts is particularly good. Each little adventure on a new world is like watching your favorite 1-hour serial drama on TV, but the episode you're watching is filler because the writers didn't have enough juicy content to fill the entire season with a mainline story. But you can't exactly skip it either because small amounts of main story are sprinkled within, all but requiring you to watch every episode so you don't accidentally miss something. I guess what I'm trying to say is that most of what ends up happening on these worlds doesn't mean much to the overall story that Kingdom Hearts is trying to tell. And while that tends to be the norm for long RPGs like this, the mini-stories that happen in those games tend to be better integrated into the overall plot. But the strength of Kingdom Hearts isn't necessarily its plot. It's the entire universe that it creates and the lore behind it. I believe it's entirely possible to have a story that's not very well told, but will captivate an audience anyway with the strength of its universe that it's built upon. And Kingdom Hearts does exactly that. The universe of Kingdom Hearts is powered by an engine of nostalgia, with just enough sprinkles of originality to keep things fresh throughout. Things like Sleeping Beauty's Maleficent being the game's central antagonist and orchestrator of the Heartless. Like Olympus from Hercules being the site of various tournament-style arenas that you can take part in for challenges and rewards. Like Peter Pan teaching the trio how to fly and glide. Like Final Fantasy's Moogle creatures being brilliant little scientists for crafting purposes. The number of possibilities is enormous, and I found myself eagerly anticipating what neat little crossover I'd get next. And even though I wish that the story had better writing...
Kyrie's inside me?
Better overall voice acting.
And there is darkness within every heart.
Hey, have you heard of someone named Ansem?
Less horrifying character models.
I'm the answer to your prayers.
And better integrated side stories.
Hey there, name's Tigger. T-I-double-G-R, that spells Tigger.
The adventure, above all, remains fairly lighthearted, fun, and whimsical, and that's due in part to how well the game has aged since 2002. I'm playing the remastered 1.5 version of Kingdom Hearts on the PlayStation 4, but a remaster can't fix everything, and the fact that this game still looks fantastic today is a testament to how strong the visual design for this franchise really is. Granted, we could probably thank Disney here more than we can thank Squeenix, but hey, a win is a win, right? That said, if you look too carefully, you can see where the PlayStation 2 just wasn't powerful enough to make things work right. Peter Pan is a soulless monster in this game, and Wendy's side of the Neverland world just looks bad at the high vantage point that you visit it from. The Colosseum should have hundreds of people watching from the stands, but the cheers instead emanate from empty bleachers. Various aspects of the game's background simply don't hold up to any amount of scrutiny, but given the year that the game was released, it's totally understandable given the power that the hardware was capable of. And the game's excellent use of shapes and color to make the worlds feel unique and lively, in spite of the narrow spaces in which they take place, more than makes up for any visual missteps caused by the weaker hardware. In addition to all that, the game's soundtrack is just absolutely delightful, and if you grew up with Disney like I did, it'll elevate the amount of nostalgia to nearly irresistible heights. Each track and the visual aesthetic of each world is carefully crafted to make that world look and feel as if it came right out of the movie. But as great as all of that is, it might as well be nothing without solid gameplay, and, well, unfortunately, that hasn't aged quite as well as the visuals have. Kingdom Hearts is an action RPG. There aren't any turn-based battles, and there aren't even separate battle screens you go into when you encounter an enemy. If there's something to fight, it'll pop into existence and get in your way, allowing you to fight immediately. Kingdom Hearts combat can be described pretty well with the word floaty. Often when you hear this word, it's in a negative connotation, as if the floaty controls are a detriment to the experience of playing the game. Instead, the floaty nature of this game's combat is clearly an intentional design choice. As you can expect, when you press the attack button, Sora swings his Keyblade. The first attack is snappy and nearly instantaneous, allowing you to react to things you see. But if you continue to strike, you'll string together a combo until you reach the finishing move. Swinging on the ground and swinging in the air result in different combos, and swinging in the air will generally keep you afloat as long as you continue to tear into the enemy, though this is usually ended by a finishing move after a few strikes. If there's one thing you're going to be doing a lot of in this game, it's hammering on that attack button. In many scenarios, that's all you really need. Lock onto an enemy and Sora will try his hardest to close the distance to that enemy and continue to wail on it, even if it's in the air. You don't even need to jump for yourself most of the time, because Sora will literally rise up to meet whatever challenge he needs to. Whether or not this is a good thing is up to the player, because what this means is that you're sacrificing more precise control of your character for connecting with your strikes more easily. It makes the game more accessible to more people and, in many ways, easier. But when you take on the harder difficulties, you start to have to fight the game's systems in a way. I played Kingdom Hearts for the first time 13 years ago or so, with the standard difficulty. And then I played it again more recently on Proud Mode. Kingdom Hearts Proud Mode is, to me at least, pretty rough. The damage you take from just about anything is high enough to make every hit count, and when you're desperately trying to find that sweet spot of a distance to make Sora dash in on his enemy so you can get in quickly and start dealing damage, but you keep misjudging the distance by a few inches, forcing you to swing pathetically at the air, it can feel like the combat system is conspiring against you to cause you to die again and again and again. In any game with action-oriented combat such as this, it requires a certain amount of finesse and an ability to learn what the character you're controlling is capable of and what he'll do with any given press of a button. That's well understood. But it feels like with Kingdom Hearts and the amount of distance that Sora tends to cover depending on where he is relative to his target makes that aspect of the combat much more difficult to read and to learn. I think the reason I felt this way comes down to two specific things. First, the overall difficulty of the combat wasn't so hard that I had to give a ton of thought to my approach or my strategy. More often than not, I was able to just lay on that X button and kill everything, just retargeting as necessary and throwing in the occasional block, dodge, or spell. It's not like I never occasionally died to the riffraff, it just wasn't ever consistently threatening enough to force me to get fancy or get good. Second, Sora's attacks are often contextual and occasionally random, completely by design. If you're in the sweet spot of distance, like I mentioned before, Sora will dash forward to his target as he attacks. Otherwise, he'll open with a standard swing. If the enemy is grounded, Sora will attempt a ground combo, but if the enemy is slightly elevated, he'll automatically jump up to initiate an air combo, even if you could technically hit it while you're still grounded. On top of that, there's at least one ability that you can equip that has a flat % chance to activate instead of a normal finishing move at the end of a combo. It's stuff like this that helps keep the combat interesting, but also makes it more difficult to learn as well as you would a fighting game. But hey, what would I know? I don't play fighting games very often, and the only one I've ever really loved is a children's party game, so perhaps I'm just really off base here. I'm also a bit more of a casual player and didn't really feel the drive to 100% complete the game or even master its combat or grind enough to defeat the almighty Sephiroth at the peak of this game's challenges, and I probably won't replay it anytime soon. But I feel like this approach is more representative of how most people will consume these games, so take that as you will. In spite of my complaints, I really did enjoy the core of the combat that Kingdom Hearts has to offer, and that part of this game's systems, at least, has aged fairly well. It's responsive and engaging, and there were few moments that I felt bored or tired of what I was doing, but that had less to do with the combat system itself and more to do with the balance and difficulty spikes of Proud Mode, which I'll dig into a little bit more later. First, I want to talk about the other systems surrounding combat. And we can't have a conversation about Kingdom Hearts without whining at least a little bit about its most awkward inclusion, the command bar. Action RPGs of the past have not been shy about being a little more hybrid in their approach to combat. Menu systems can be complicated, and in an RPG where you have dozens of choices available to you at any given moment, navigating that in the heat of combat can be clunky, confusing, frustrating, and worst of all, deadly. So instead of trying to manage that, these old games allowed you to pause the game as you navigated these menus to use items or spells, allowing you to take your time to find the right thing and to use it at the right moment. A simple but effective compromise. I guess Square Enix just really wanted to lean into the action part of the combat here because say goodbye to pausing the combat to menu. Instead, you're required to set up your limited amount of shortcuts and equipped items before the combat starts, and once you're in the heat of battle, what you get is what you've got. This will be important in a minute. It turns out that your attack button isn't actually an attack button. You're just constantly selecting the attack command from this menu. Other commands that are available to you are Magic, Items, and Summon. Magic takes you to a submenu with up to 7 spells, the Items menu will take you to a submenu of however many items you have equipped, and the Summon menu will take you to a submenu of friends that you can summon to the battlefield. On paper, this is actually pretty neat. This kind of system ensures that the action doesn't cease and keeps the game exciting, and if you think about it, it kinda makes sense that your attention will be taken away from attacking and split just enough to be dangerous while you use an item or cast a spell that you don't have prepared. It adds a little bit of extra spice to flavor the combat with, and a small amount of risk for the reward that these other menus can offer. On paper, I love it. But in reality, it's annoying and something that I was all too happy to avoid for a majority of my playthrough. You might be thinking that proper use of magic is integral to survival and to have more fun with the game, and you're absolutely right. The developers had just enough foresight to include a shortcut button that turns 3 of your face buttons into a spellcasting button so that you can cast a few of your favorite spells as readily as you want, with no menuing required. Why only 3 buttons though? Why not 4? Why not a second shortcut toggling button so I can have more options ready at a moment's notice? It's weird because while the developers could have excluded this little feature, this feature is precisely why I rarely felt the want or need to manually dig into my magic menu. The only reason I ever bothered to dig was to cast a defensive spell, Arrow, as it became nearly required for some of the game's later bosses. And even then, it was eventually worth sacrificing one of my attack spells on the shortcut menu to have easier access to this spell. As for the items, you end up being conditioned pretty early on to not ever touch these things except in an emergency. To have an item ready for combat, you have to equip it in one of your limited item slots. Again, this is great on paper because it makes your resources in the heat of combat limited to those you have ready. But the act of actually equipping these is one of the most tedious and ridiculous set of menu commands that I've ever had to deal with in any video game, and that's not an exaggeration. To equip an item, you first need to go into the item menu and select whose inventory you want to fill. Then, one at a time, you need to select an item slot, select exchange, then select another inventory to source from, and finally select the item from that inventory. It doesn't sound like a lot, but you need to do this so many times to fill up everybody's inventory that it's really not worth the time, especially with as quickly as your allies tend to burn through their stock. This is kind of a spoiler for Kingdom Hearts 2, but this issue was remedied in that game with automatic re-equipping of used consumables, making them less tedious to keep at the ready. But this game has no such feature, and effectively invalidates the entire system in all but the most difficult of boss battles. How this system was ever greenlit by the higher-ups on this development team, I'll never know. It's so bad. As for the summons, well, I never really felt the need to ever use them, and the first few times that I tried, once I remembered that I had them, I got punished by dying pretty quickly, not really knowing what was going on, or what I was doing. To make matters worse, the game forces you to watch a relatively long cutscene as the summon appears. Cool the first time, I guess, but a bit strange that it's unskippable considering how much the game's design is focused towards non-stop action. Tinkerbell was the one exception to my lack of summoning, and she is incredibly useful. Not only does she slowly regenerate health for you and your allies, but she'll do so until you receive a killing blow, which she'll save you from before leaving. I had no idea this summon was so powerful until my chat told me about it on stream, and it was the reason I was able to finally defeat Maleficent at the end of the game. For a standard mode playthrough, you could probably get through the game just fine without ever touching any of these summons. They're not even that interesting or exciting or powerful, except for Tinkerbell. And there's not really any incentive that I found that made me want to use them, so why bother? All in all, the command bar is something that I couldn't ever get used to in this game, no matter how much I used it. Sure, I got faster at using it, but it never felt comfortable. So unless I needed to use an item in an emergency, or cast Arrow in a pinch, or summon Tinkerbell because she's overpowered, I avoided it as much as possible. And being required to do these things ended up being exceedingly rare, even in Proud Mode. That said, Proud Mode for Kingdom Hearts 1 was a rough experience for me. From the very first real boss of the game, I had a lot of trouble surviving. This first boss killed me a few times before I decided to go grind for another level or two to make the fight a bit more manageable, and that wasn't the last time I felt the need to do this. A significant portion of the major bosses in the game caused enough of an issue for me that I felt the need to take the extra time to get just a bit stronger, and this was consistent till the very end of the game, and the final boss. However, even after grinding for levels, the amount of power I'd gained usually wasn't so substantial that I wiped the floor with a boss that was giving me trouble. It just gave me a little more damage output and allowed me to take another hit or two before falling over. Beating the boss was still a challenge that forced me to use what tools I had, learn the opponent's moves, and plan my own accordingly. But because of that, finally achieving victory felt good. I felt like I had actually accomplished something, and even though some of the boss fights felt a little unfair in places, I'm looking at you, Maleficent and Trickmaster, it was probably just a case of get good because I was eventually able to overcome the particular challenges of each fight and felt all the more rewarded for my trouble. A lot of the boss fights in this game end up being a bit of a difficulty spike in Proud Mode though, such that you might get frustrated if you're not patient. From what I've read, Final Mix did do some minor rebalancing of Proud Mode for Kingdom Hearts, but it feels like it could have been smoothed out a bit better than it is. The first few bosses especially are incredibly rough depending on your early choices, but at the same time, I feel like I would have been bored out of my mind on regular mode. I don't want to talk too much about balance though, just because of how wildly the experience will vary from player to player, depending on their patience, their skill, their gaming experience, and how much they just end up leveling during the normal course of their play. So other than pointing out the difficulty spikes of the bosses, according to my experience, I think spending any more time on balance here would be a waste of time. And I want to mention again that I approached this game fairly casually, so keep that in mind as I continue, because I'm going to complain about the enemy design now. I also want to stress that a majority of this game's enemies and bosses are just fine. The little elemental mages are fun to chase down, the various grunts are great to take down by the dozens, and the fatties are a neat little shakeup that forces you to change your approach as you fight, and an enemy that I'd frankly love to have a plush toy of. But as you get more towards the end of the game, a specific enemy started to become much more common in many of the worlds as you explore more and search for items. It's this enemy called the Invisible, and it's one of the most frustratingly designed enemies in this entire game, to the point where I thought that this game's enemies had much more problems than they really do. They made that much of a negative impression on me. Half the time you're fighting these guys, they're fine. They're an endgame challenge, and as such, they'll challenge your reflexes and your ability to fight and can tear you up if you're not careful. The other half of the time though, they'll stab their sword into the ground, disappear, and make you wait for their attack to go off. You cannot attack this enemy for the duration of this ability, and the only thing that you can do is wait for it to come back out of hiding and hope that it doesn't immediately do the same attack. Enemies with abilities like this are a pet peeve of mine. Enemies that turn themselves invulnerable with no real counterplay other than to burst it down and wait out the attack are not fun. There's a handful of other enemies in the game with attacks like this. The ghosts, dark balls, and wizardy dudes come to mind, but the duration is much shorter and don't bring the fight to a complete grinding halt the same way these guys do. The instant these things showed up though, I began to hate many of the other enemies that do this much more than I did when I encountered them during earlier portions of the game. Again, the Invisibles left that much of a negative impression on me. And speaking of confusing design choices that shouldn't exist, this game also has a really bad habit of allowing an enemy to live at one hit point no matter how much you beat on it, just because it's not through with its super important attack yet. These giant invisible lizard dudes are a perfect example. If they're shooting eye lasers at you and you drain all of their health, you're gonna have to wait until it's done spewing its beams in your face if you want it to actually die. This was so frustrating, especially when a single hit from these guys took away so much of my health. Complaining aside though, I said that Kingdom Hearts combat is fun and engaging for a significant portion of its runtime, and I mean it. Even if the bosses were a bit frustrating at the beginning and the end of the game, and even though some of the enemies became tedious because of their mechanics. As simple as the combat system is, it's not without its depth. There's a lot to learn about Sora's tendencies and capabilities to make you a better player, and enough to know about the magic system to give you advantages if you know when to use each spell. Casting spells in between your combos or just to outrange a troublesome enemy is what kept the combat spicy for me, and I was surprised to hear that some people go through the entire game without ever really touching any of it. Sure, you don't really need to most of the time, but it keeps the combat interesting and it keeps you alive, even if you don't choose a magic-focused build. That's right, builds. Kingdom Hearts does something unique from other action RPGs when it comes to deciding what your character's advancement should focus on. At the very beginning of the game, you're asked to choose one aspect of strength, magic, or defense to empower, and one to sacrifice. These have a significant effect on your power and survivability throughout the game, and while I'm not exactly sure on the specifics of each effect, sacrificing defense sounds like a good excuse to start the game over completely, if you're on proud mode at least. I'm really torn about this system because on one hand, it's a small incentive to replay the game with a different build, but on the other, it's too simple and too obfuscated to be super interesting for a casual playthrough. Before you really know anything about the combat system or the game or what you might want to focus on, you're forced to make this choice, and it not only determines your base stats, but it also determines the order in which abilities unlock for you. Most notably, if you choose Shield, you get one of the game's most important abilities, at a relatively comfortable level 15, but the sword gets it at 24, while the staff has to wait until level 33. Well into the middle of the game! I'm all for unlocking abilities as you go through the game, but to put a simple block command behind a level wall in this manner is borderline irresponsible in an action-focused game such as this. I know I really would have liked this ability for the Trickster boss's fireball spam at the beginning of the game. I feel like because this ability was missing, this boss, which was one of the very first bosses of the game, was incredibly difficult for me. Aside from the game's fairly simple equipment system, which I won't really go into detail for here because it's pretty straightforward, and if you've played any kind of RPG, you're probably already pretty comfortable here, the game's ability system is the bread and butter of Sora's mechanical advancement. You'll unlock spells and summons as the game moves forward in the story, but leveling up grants Sora access to more and more abilities that change the flow of Sora's combos, grant him special capabilities, or just make his health and magic more reliable. This is where you'll spend some time theory crafting and carefully budgeting, because you don't have an unlimited amount of ability points to spend on equipping these. Sora's attacks are incredibly straightforward when the game starts, giving you nothing more than a 3-hit combo. But soon you'll start boosting the number of attacks in your combos and unleashing special finishing moves depending on the abilities you've decided to equip. You'll also gain access to defensive abilities like Second Chance, which saves you from a death blow if your HP is higher than 1, defensive abilities like Dodge Roll and Guard, sustainability abilities like MP Haste to speed up the rate at which your magic recharges, and utility abilities such as Treasure Magnet and Scan that just make your life much easier. I love systems like this as it allows for equal parts experimentation and customization as you play through the game. Getting a new ability is often pretty exciting, as you'll find yourself immediately going into your ability menu to see what you've learned and whether or not it's worth trading one of your other abilities away so you can equip it. However, I can't help but shake the feeling that the developers either went overboard or simply ran out of ideas with some of these. Like I mentioned earlier, you have to wait until you're a high enough level to unlock Guard, which I really feel should be a baseline ability due to how important it is to the overall gameplay. You also don't unlock Dodge Roll until you've beaten the game's first real boss, which sucks because this boss is not very easy at the beginning of the game when you have no spells, few items, and low levels. Dodge Roll would have gone a long way in making at least this fight a little less punishing, as would have Guard. Something to give you a little more agency in this fight other than hoping the enemy doesn't hit you in between your attacks. These things, which I see as core to the combat system, should have been bundled in with the Keyblade. And speaking of frustrations with the ability system, I have to complain about one of the more frustrating sins that this game commits. A sin that I count among my biggest pet peeves in video games. If you want to grab the loot that falls out of any of your enemies, you need to walk over every last individual piece to collect it. Yeah, I get it, there are dozens of other things you could probably think of that would outright ruin a game, while this is just a minor annoyance or inconvenience, but this is just one of those little things that affects nearly every portion of any game that falls victim to this design choice and, as far as I'm concerned, is only meant to slow the game down. The intent here is probably to make killing enemies feel more rewarding and more flashy by having them explode into goodies like a heartless piñata, and I guess at that it sort of succeeds, but instead I just feel robbed if I'm not able to collect every bit of dropped money because it disappeared for no reason just before I could reach it. And that assumes I even felt like picking it up in the first place. Luckily though, I never felt like I needed a lot of money in this game. Part of that has to do with how unusable the item system was, but it at least made losing money on the ground less of a punch in the gut. Other things that drop though include items, as well as health and magic refill orbs to give you a boost after defeating an enemy. Those are often worth going out of your way for, and do feel rewarding as you pick them up, but I'd still prefer not to have to chase down loot as hard as this game wants you to. The reason I included this complaint with the abilities is because there's one ability called Treasure Magnet that increases your pickup radius just a bit, and honestly, I felt like it still wasn't enough. On top of that, you're spending 2 of your precious few ability points on this, which is fairly significant considering the amount of abilities you're given to choose from, and the fact that I only had 37 ability points available by the time I beat the game. And speaking of the end of the game, remember how I said Maleficent was the orchestrator of the Heartless and the game's central antagonist? Yeah, I lied. Surprise! She was also simply a pawn to the real antagonist, a scientist known only as Ansem, who has been central to the research into the heart and the Heartless. He has managed to nest in the darkness within Riku and, eventually, completely possess the boy and morph the body into one he's more comfortable in. Only after traveling to the place where worlds go to die and defeating Ansem in an absolutely insane multi-phased fight in which his stand grows progressively more powerful and grotesque, are Sora, Donald, and Goofy finally reunited with Riku and King Mickey, respectively. The latter of whom is an absolute heartless-destroying badass with Keyblade powers of his own. This was nuts when you first found it out back in the day. I wish I was clever enough to make all that up, but that's the story. Riku and Mickey end up trapped within the Dark Realm, even though that was supposed to be the door to Kingdom Hearts, and Sora literally just said, I know now that Kingdom Hearts is light!
Kingdom Hearts is light!
And that light finished off Ansem? I don't know, man. But after that, Sora is separated from Kairi for what feels like no real good reason other than to set up the sequel. Like I said, I don't think the story is very well crafted, and there's a lot of things left unexplained, and I think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that a significant chunk of the game is meaningless Disney filler. Very occasionally, a story beat will happen in the middle of a Disney story, but really most of the game is you visiting worlds to make friends and grow stronger as you master the Keyblade. Not an unnecessary journey for a fledgling hero, to be sure, but come on, the rest of the game could have at least been a little more relevant to the overarching plot. Maybe then the story could feel better paced, make more sense, and the scale of the conflict could feel a little more grand beyond, Wonderland has Heartless in it, oh no! But really, that's part of the appeal of this game, isn't it? Nobody who dove into Kingdom Hearts back in 2002 knew who Sora was, or cared about the Heartless or Ansem's malicious plotting. We dove in because of the wild combination of franchises that were never intended to collide, and we stayed for the fun combat and the interesting worlds that we got to explore, maybe fueled by a little bit of nostalgia. And I think that part of the magic in the overall design of this breakout title of the franchise was just how well designed these worlds really were. Except for Hollow Bastion, at least. That place was a nightmare to navigate, and I couldn't wait to be done with it because of all the horribly slow-moving elevator platforms and confusing maze-like structure of it. But you might laugh at the well-designed statement after having spent roughly half an hour by now looking at the footage in this video or having played the game yourself, but the more I think about it, the more I really love the way these worlds were crafted. Surprisingly, each world is actually very small, consisting of a small handful of rooms, where usually just a bit over half of them are relevant to traversal. The rest are just drop-off points from a one-way gate, a small treasure room, or simply just the world's starting room. But even with as small as the worlds are, they're more complex than they let on. This is because of two big reasons. First, the world is often somewhat non-linear, with branching paths and different ways to get the player from point A to point B. Second, the basic architecture of the worlds are, more often than not, completely insane. If you were to try and lay out the rooms from each world on a map where their connections make sense enough to build a bigger picture of that world, you'd find that they just don't. The physical architecture of most of the worlds simply doesn't make logical sense from a spatial point of view. I'd call that a negative point of complexity, but I feel that the raw exploration potential granted by the non-linearity of the worlds more than makes up for anything that's lost to the chaos of nonsensical door connections. These non-linear connections allow the world to unfold in a slightly different way with each of the world's story beats, and do a pretty decent job of keeping the adventure from feeling too repetitive as you work through it. But more importantly to me, it allows for some neat ways to hide some treasure throughout these worlds, and because of that, it truly feels like you found something fun when you manage to uncover one of these slightly out-of-the-way treasures, even if it is just another Gummi Ship piece. It almost feels like a little Easter egg hunt within the game, and I actually had quite a bit of fun with it. Especially since some of the treasures are locked away behind abilities that you don't have yet, enticing you to come back later and fully explore the world when you're more capable. Speaking of the Gummi Ship though, well, I don't want to speak of the Gummi Ship. If anything has aged worse than the inventory system I complained about earlier, it's the Gummi Ship sections. This feels like an amateur clone of Star Fox 64. It controls poorly, aiming is unnecessarily difficult because it's ridiculously fast and also moves your ship around, and it neither felt interesting or exciting to me. For the most part, you'll probably find yourself wildly flailing and shooting at the same time, trying to avoid anything coming at you, and it mostly just felt like pointless busy work to keep me from reaching the next world too quickly. But since you're given the ability to warp to worlds you've already been to without needing to play through a Gummi section again pretty early on, it doesn't get in the way too much. It winds up being pretty optional after beating a section once, so it thankfully was only a very small blemish instead of a terrible nuisance that I suspect would have caused many players to want to quit and never look back. All critique aside, Kingdom Hearts is a game that excels at the journey, even if the destination feels confusing and nonsensical. Fans of Disney and action RPG games will find a lot to love here, and even though Proud Mode pretty thoroughly kicked my ass on more than one occasion, I'm glad that I chose it. It was a fun challenge, and with the exception of a few poorly designed bosses, the feeling of overcoming the challenge was palpable and very addicting. That said, if you're wanting to play Kingdom Hearts for the first time just for the experience, I would recommend against playing Proud Mode, at least for this title. For most players, certain sections of the game will put up a very high wall that could feel impossible to pass, and grinding for extra experience and levels will waste a lot of your time. If you're comfortable with a good level of challenge though, and that's what you're looking for in these games, go ahead and go for Proud Mode, because I don't think you'll be disappointed by it. One thing I haven't yet mentioned is all of the extra content that Square Enix usually packs into its games. From side quests to item collection to post-game content, Kingdom Hearts has all of the usual trappings. Depending on the difficulty setting you're on and how quickly you want to get through the game, you could either take or leave many of these. But I was happy to have so many Coliseum fights available to challenge, to level up and gain powerful new weapons for my arsenal. Most of the Coliseum is completely optional though, so if you don't want to bother with its admittedly tedious challenges, especially if you're losing a lot like I did, then you really don't have to. But you'd be missing out on Danny DeVito training you to become a hero and, a lot of experience points to level you up. It'd be your loss, really. Besides, I'm a bit of a sucker for challenge arenas like this. And those challenge arenas get pretty rough with further optional challenges like solo mode for each tournament, and extra hard fights like a fight with the Frost Titan, or even a one-on-one fight with none other than Sephiroth, who will murder you. There's also item collection, item synthesis, crafting the Ultima weapon, Winnie the Pooh's terrible mini-games that I really hate and despise and fear every single time that I come into this game, and Gummi Ship missions if you're feeling extra completionisty and don't mind the weirdness and gimmickiness and poor controls of the Gummi Ship sections. There is so much to do in this game depending on how much you want to get out of it, and while I wouldn't recommend grinding out the Ultima weapon or synthesis recipes due to some very specific and sometimes frustrating requirements for collecting some of the in-game items, there are definitely worse things you could be doing with your time, especially if you're trying to power up for your showdown with Sephiroth. So yeah, I think that Kingdom Hearts holds up remarkably well today. It may be simpler and slower and less flashy than its descendants, but it feels good and is very satisfying to play. If you haven't played it at all or haven't touched it in a decade, now might be a good time to revisit it, if only to appreciate how far the series has come and how it's changed for the better and for the worse, something that I hope to explore more in depth as we push towards the other games. As you'd probably expect, the next video will be over Kingdom Hearts 2, unless I decided to take a pit stop somewhere else, which I might. Regardless, I feel like this script came out a bit meandering and unfocused, but it's already taken me much more time than I expected to get this video done, so I can't take the time to rewrite it. Regardless, I hope that you enjoyed this retrospective on the original Kingdom Hearts. I'll try to do the Kingdom Hearts 2 script a bit better and hopefully faster than this one, now that I have this one done. But hey, if you want to be sure to catch that video when I release it, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss it. And let me know what you think down in the comment section below. And by the way, I have been streaming twice a week over at twitch.tv/ingeniousclown. I've been playing a variety of games. I played the entirety of the Kingdom Hearts trilogy over there, and now I'm working through God of War 2018, and I believe next I'll be working on Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. That's been happening every Tuesday evening and Saturday morning, American time. So if that sounds like something that interests you, why not come over to twitch.tv/ingeniousclown and hang out. Until then, bye-bye.